Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair Yunus, and if you've been tuning into this podcast and enjoying our content, then I have a recommendation for you because the Tabad Lab is starting a new podcast called Dragon Road, which is hosted by Arif Rafiq. Its first season is out with the first episode out this week. And so you can go and enjoy that discussion on Dragon Road, which covers the growing influence of China around the world with a specific focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. So the link is down below in the description. You can put in Dragon Road in your favorite podcast platform and subscribe over there. And I really think that you will enjoy these discussions that Arif has had over the last few weeks. And with that, we start with our episode today. We're joined by Halima Iqbal, who is CEO and co-founder of Oran. Oran is a collaborative platform for group savings and trying to boost financial inclusion, particularly as it relates to women in the country. Halima graduated from the University of Waterloo. She started her career in investment banking, working at TD Securities, moved on, did consulting work on fintech products, started her own startup called Meal Surfers, and she's a certified chef. And then moved to Pakistan in 2017. So she's one of those startup founders who's worked abroad, moved back to Pakistan, is now trying to solve a major challenge that the country has, which is financial inclusion. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Halima to understand what Oran is all about and how she sees the fintech and startup ecosystem in the country. So with that, Halima, thank you so much for taking out the time and welcome to Pakistonomy.
Thank you so much for having me. Super excited for this conversation.
So let's start with Oran. Like, help us understand where did the idea come from, what Oran is all about, and what's it's been like having a financial startup in Pakistan trying to solve this financial inclusion challenge in the country.
Great. So Oran actually, so when I moved back from North America, late 2017, early 2018. One of the few things that were very obvious that women for finance was very limited. I, as a consumer to finance, had a really hard time opening up just basic bank accounts. When I started looking around what was happening, I realized I was not the only one. There are 50 million adult women like me out there, not having access to bank account, and then obviously not having more sophisticated formal financial products, which led to me led to a research. My co-founder at that time, Farwa Tapal, had also moved back from Spain after doing her MBA from ISARE. Her background is in design from Rhode Island School of Design in the US. And she was also looking at solving for and really understanding the space a little more. So together we started researching. And what we found out that while the formal economy is not necessarily catering to the large majority of the population, there's an informal economy that exists, which banks through your committees or ROSCAs. And with a sample size of about 4,000 people, we realized that 41% of the Pakistani population actually engages in these committees, which was actually a very exciting piece of information that we found. And then we started really understanding the operational modalities of it and the relationship dynamic within these committees and why they were so prevalent, right? Like, it provides that access to liquidity. It is also Sharia compliant, which sits really well with the religious sensitivities of large majority of the population. And it provides that forced budgeting tool to people. And it is gender inclusive, where women take part in these committees 1.3 times more than men. So all these things that we are finding out and unraveling while doing our research led us to find a business opportunity in terms of, if we were to take something that's so embedded in the lives of a common person, how does that translate into when there is a technology intervention? So we started experimenting with what the product would look like. How do you take something that has existed in the market for so many years and try to digitize it and try to cater to a market that might have not necessarily seen a product like this before. So that's really how Oran started. I think it was not just to solve for my personal pain points in terms of accessing finance, but also looking at from a broader perspective and finding that finance is not necessarily, until today, we're the only women first fintech in Pakistan. Finance is not necessarily on a broader level being looked at it from a gender perspective, which was extremely important for us because we make up half of this country's population.
Yeah, and I think statistically as well, right? In terms of access to bank accounts, access to mobile phones, women are there's a big gender divide or gap in Pakistan even at this point in time, right? And frequently, if I'm on social media, every other week or so, you will see some thread about how banking is terrible in Pakistan, especially for women, right? You need pay slips and you need guardian certificate, all sorts of things that are just like, why are these onerous regulations there in the system? Why can't you just walk into a bank? Like, I've been in the United States since 2007. I came here as a student. I walked into a bank and had a bank account in 15 minutes, right? It's hard doing the same thing in Pakistan. And it's just such a big challenge. When you looked at digitizing this experience and bringing these women on board or bringing people on board into committees through a digital experience, how does it work? Because my understanding of committees and Roscas is that, you typically partner with or get together with extended friends and family. There is this local community trust that's in the process built in. So how does Oran approach this sector and say, you know what, we can offer something better through a digital experience?
Mm-hmm. So the audience that we cater to, we spend a lot of time understanding the customer and trying to figure out what is actually the customer need, right? When a woman is trying to raise capital for herself, and if she's going down the route of doing neighborhood committees, her financial health is always dependent on the social network or the geographical location she belongs to, right? And that was an interesting insight for us to say that, okay, if these women are aspirational, they are your prime middle income to lower middle income audience, which is looking for that little access to capital to then be able to take control of their financial futures. And that was a really interesting opportunity for us to say that if we were to digitally onboard them, what is that experience going to look like, and how do you bridge that gap in terms of trust as well, right? One of the reasons why people are not willing to come into the formal economy, other than the formal economy not serving them, is that trust deficit. So we started learning with the customer itself and realized that she actually wants to be able to come on board and be slightly anonymous in terms of raising that capital and have that agency, authority, and autonomy over her finances. That's why bridging that gap and building a brand that is more lifestyle related rather than just pure financial services. So what is the language she's speaking? What is the time that she's available at? What are the different concepts that she understand and not understand? So understanding that customer persona, we felt, was really important in terms of building that trust with the customer, who then comes in digitally and onboards herself to be able to take the committees of her choice. So it could be anything from 2,000 rupees to up to 10,000 rupees, 20,000 rupees, whatever her ability is.
So from a timeline perspective, then how does yours, I remember reading, and correct me if I am wrong or things have changed, but your offering is about 10 months or so, or less than a year. And then there is obviously, in a country like Pakistan, long-term committees, I view, because of the high inflation rates in the country, are a loss-making thing for anyone to invest or save in, because by the time you get your money back, the real purchasing power has declined. 10 months does help with that to a certain extent, but it still is something that people are losing out real purchasing power. So from your point of view, when you've built that trust, how does that operate over 10 months, and how do you make that situation work for somebody in terms of how does the cash get disseminated, etc.? But B, now that you build that trust, like what's next? Like in terms of financial literacy, more sophisticated savings instruments, whether they are Sharia compliant or not. Again, there's an offering to be made there. How are you thinking about making that trust as the foundational element of a much longer and much more sophisticated financial journey for those that are saving with you?
So we want to be able to build a neobank, a women-first neobank, catering to the requirements in the ways that women want to be catered to without having too many barriers to entry. So that's the plan. And ROSCA's committees serve as that launch pad or the entry point into it. So that's really how we see it as well. And in terms of bridging the gap and her coming in, she is not always going to be looking for earlier committees, right? Her life revolves around committees, and there's a life event attached to why she wants to be able to raise capital. So whether it is for her medical treatments, travel, her own wedding, her education, whatever that reason might be, but she is thinking ahead. And we're providing her with that platform to make that budgeting activity a lot easier for her. And that's why this 10-month cycle, while yes, they're in the informal setting, they're like things can go up to like 30, 40 months where the value of the money gets beaten up by inflation. We try to keep it in a less than a year tenure so that she also sees sight of the capital that she's raising, right? And she's then starting to think, okay, if I'm putting it for 10 months, what are the options in terms of sophisticated products that I can eventually take on as well? So now she's becoming slightly more aware of the options that she has and what all can she do with the capital that she raises. And it's not always based on consumption. It is slowly and gradually moving on to wealth building products as well. And that's really how we see the extension of the base happening, with taking what the ROSCAs of the committee serve as the baseline and then building on top of it.
Yeah, it's almost like, you said early on that you found that a high proportion of these women were actually saving through these ROSCAs or committees. And it's one of those things that they have different targets, right? Either somebody's wedding, their child's wedding, college education, school graduation, healthcare, parents' retirement supplies, etc. And it's almost like the market does not meet their needs and demands. So informally, they've gone out and come together as communities, as networks, to find out ways in their own way to solve for those challenges. And that is just the foundation, right? And there's a lot more that can be done through that.
Absolutely.
From the question I had was, from your point of view, as you've engaged with these people and tried to offer them the service, what are some things that have surprised you that, you're like, when you started, you assumed that the informal market or these women approach their savings a certain way. And now you look back and say, okay, I've done work in this industry for a number of years and did not anticipate that this is how people actually approach how they think about building wealth or saving their capital.
I mean, one of the things that is very, very obvious was women's requirement for capital or accessing finance is no different than a man's. They need savings, they need insurance, they need credit. So it's not about like their requirements are any different. It is how she's going to go utilize it is going to be slightly different. But also she's always going to put the family first and then herself. And that was a bit interesting insight for her, because finance is largely looked as individualistic. And when you play that social part in it, and that's why the committee structure works so beautifully for women, is because of the social nature of them. So that was one of the things that was surprising to us. The other thing is she's competitive when it comes to building her financial identity or being able to compete in terms of her payment behavior with the peers that she might not even know. But the fact that she's found this platform which validates her payment behavior and transaction history, she is competitive. And that was very, very surprising for us. And overall, generally, what we also realized that women are better payers than men. And then we started researching and looking at a lot of literature that's available that supports this as well, right? Like women are much better payers of credit than men are.
They're not going to go gamble away or buy some drugs or alcohol to drown their sorrows in that. They're going to come back and pay that money. But add some color to this competitive thing. I'm curious to understand more about in what sense are they competitive? Like what are some things that you've seen that you're like, oh my God, like this person is super competitive?
So one of the things that we do is that in terms of rewarding a good behavior when it comes to social settings, social finance, we put out, like if you are a good payer and if you're paying on time, you get a star, right? Instead of like showing her a number of a credit history or whatever, which she will probably not understand and she would not even want to understand. So we gamify that and we give her a star for every good action that she takes. And she wants that. She wants to be able to come first every month, or be on the top tier of the payment score, which is very exciting to see that even in a setting where she does not know anybody, but the fact that she's coming and saying that the transaction that was predominantly done by my male counterpart, I am doing that and I'm getting rewarded for that, gives her that sense of financial empowerment. So she's then able to make her financial decisions without the permission of her male counterpart, right? Initially, when people would come in and like, okay, we're gonna ask our husbands or fathers or brothers about it first. Now she's coming in and she's like, we can make this decision ourselves. And that to be able to see that shift happening is very exciting. And I think it comes from giving them the kind of financial literacy that we provide through the platform and market access to then slowly but surely being able to change the behavior and getting her more comfortable into the digital financial services world without her being like intimidated by what was happening with finance and the concepts around it, etc.
We've had a pandemic globally. In Pakistan in particular, what's been tragic is the high rate of inflation and the erosion that has done in terms of purchasing power and savings capacity for households. How have you seen behavior shift on Oran with these savers who are combating probably a whole host of issues, health, economic, high inflation, maybe some loved ones have lost jobs, etc. So have you seen any noticeable differences or changes that have happened over the last 12 to 18 months that you look at and say, you know what, this is primarily a pandemic-induced shift that has happened in the market?
I think from our perspective, the shift on digital uptake of digital financial services like digital transactions, we saw a ridiculously high rate of that shift happening. The other thing that was very interesting to see was that whole concept of savings that we all struggle with and want to be able to save, that just got accelerated. People started understanding the importance of having an emergency fund and having some pool of capital set aside for economic crisis that can come anytime now, right? So that willingness to then be able to say that, hey, we don't know what's going to happen, but we need a little bit of a pool of capital set aside for emergency purposes, whatever that emergency might be, right? And irrespective of people losing their jobs, they've been able to contribute little to then be able to build that emergency fund or some form and shape of pool of capital to be then able to cater to any kind of economic crisis that could come into their lives. So that shift in terms of the importance of savings that we've been championing for just saw a very high growth and shift during this pandemic, which was very exciting. Like while we understand the credit requirements was also increased, but the mindset also shifted. That it's, if I am taking too much credit, it will actually come and hurt me. So I need to start thinking about, from bare minimum, start with having some cash around, and then think about how do I build my wealth.
I think that's great, right? From your perspective, it's like credit demand went up, which means there's obviously more customers coming in. But as they think about having this sort of risk-free asset lying around and risk-free instruments, that's great for you to then offer complementary products to this customer base that now trusts you, which makes me wonder, like, what's next? You talked about having a bank that provides more sophisticated services, but when you look at sort of the next 12 to 18 months, we look at, or I've read about fintechs, worked with a couple of them myself. They talk about all sorts of things like credit scores and profit pools and consumer durable financing and education funds, all of that. But it's a whole lot of things. But most of the time, I find it curious that there's no prioritization in terms of looking at what the customer need is, where your customer is in terms of their own maturity, their own life needs. So where are you looking at in terms of, you've got the Roscas, you've got the committees, and now you have a trusted relationship. And what do you want to offer to your customers next to make sure that not only can Oran scale up, but they can also go to the next level in terms of their overall financial journey?
I think the first thing for us is using this platform to then formally financially include these people, right? Like women still don't necessarily have bank accounts. So we've taken the product first approach to then open up bank accounts and give them enough of a use case to utilize that bank account and get comfortable there. Once they're comfortable with that, then we're going to go into more wealth building verticals. So add on more on from a savings perspective.
Got it. And so,
and then the data repositories get richer, and then you build on top of it. But I think for us, it has been a very focused approach that scale this foundation, get them formally included, and then go on to the wealth building side of the products.
On the formal inclusion with bank accounts, women don't have that. Cell phone gaps is still there. From your point of view, and maybe we can start jumping into a bit of the policy side of the conversation. Where do you see a need for policy, whether it's the state bank, whether it's federal government policy, the need for that to shift to accelerate that inclusion, right? Because Oran or any other fintech can only do so much. The biggest lever that is accessible is the government or the State Bank of Pakistan. So from your point of view, what are the things that they need to look at and say, like, it is an abomination that Pakistan has lower financial inclusion rates for women than India and Bangladesh, even though culturally these countries are very similar. So clearly something's not working and needs solving for. What would you like to see them do?
I'll just add on to that stat a little bit to tell you the reality of the situation. 5% of the entire world's unbanked population actually resides in Pakistan, which is really sad. We make up half of this country's population, and very few of us are formally financially included. And that only means just opening up a bank account. But from a policy perspective, I think the regulator is working quite a bit in this space. There is a gender finance policy that's coming out. The draft came out last year in December. And we've been able to provide some recommendations on our end of the importance. It's not just a policy change, it's actually a mindset change, right? Like even if the policy gets implemented, the gender finance policy that's coming out, which has some really phenomenal parts to it, but even if that gets implemented, it's about a mindset shift that needs to happen. You need to realize that a woman requires a bank account. and that women requiring a bank account has nothing to do with her male counterpart. A male counterpart should not come in and give some kind of a guarantee for her to be above 25,000 rupees worth. So things like that are going to change. But I also think from a women in finance perspective, I think we need more leaders out there. I think we do need people more on the leadership roles, decision makers within financial institutions from a gender perspective. A woman talking about a woman building for a woman rather than what historically has happened. I think that also needs to change. So while there is a policy shift, but the mindset shift needs to happen. And I think the banks also need to start realizing the problem is it's massive, and it's only going to hinder the economic growth of the country if you don't start now. We are already way too late than our comparable countries, right? So it really needs to, but the regulator right now is very, very forthcoming and looking at finance, not from a neutral perspective, but an inclusive perspective, which is a very fresh perspective.
So I have a point of view on this, but I wondered, and you don't have to answer this, but I'm just curious, came in my mind. Why is it that you think that banks in Pakistan are not geared towards including more people in the banking system, right? We see like they're just happy with the way things are with the status quo, whether it relates to online banking, whether it relates to the cumbersome process of opening a bank account, especially if you're a woman. Like, why is it that they're just not motivated to onboard more people? Because one would argue that by doing so, a bank in and of itself is making more money and trying to get more revenue and profit in the door. But they're not keen and motivated to do that. I was just curious if you have a point of view on why that's the case.
I think the banking system is not researched enough to understand how the customer has matured and what the customer segmentation looks like of the of an average person outside of their high net worths. They don't understand that, right? And banking is still seen as a privilege. I think it's both a supply and a demand issue. But because if from a supply side it is seen as a privilege, and if I am middle income and I am walking in with 5,000 rupees to open up a bank account, the cost of onboarding me is a lot higher for the bank for to this. It's easier for them to say, "Bhai, aap chali jaye, aapko zarurat nahi hai bank account." And that's the reality. Like when I moved back, I was told that I don't need a bank account. And even today that happens, right? Like if a single woman who's not married, who has no job, try going into a bank, right?
So you were told by a bank branch manager or someone at a bank that you don't need a bank account.
We recently did a case study, and we worked with multiple personas of ours and tried to send them to a bank branch to open up a bank account. And the women were told, you don't need a bank account, and if you were a business owner, then we need to come and validate your business first and see if it's real or not, to then be able to open up your bank account. And if you are a salaried individual, then why don't you just tell your corporate to open up a bank account for you? So that these are the realities. And I think while the policy shift will help, it is really the mindset shift that needs to happen. And it has to come from the leadership of the banking institutes to then say that there is a focus and we need to really work towards and give gender sensitivity trainings to our employees to be then able to interact with women like human beings and let them open up a bank account.
Yeah, a friend of mine sent a video clip earlier this week. And it was basically him asking one of the leading security brokers in the country about why they don't have a more easier process for students that are at IBA or at business schools in Pakistan to open up a brokerage account, because he was like, we're learning about finance and we want to start trading in the stock market and apply our skills. So why have you not bothered to like look at us as long-term lifetime customers? And the guy starts with a jumbled answer, to which then he concludes by basically saying, well, you all are students right now, and we don't want you to be distracted from your studies. And therefore, we think that it's not, something that you should be doing. Is something that you should be doing is focusing on your studies and not trading in the stock market and applying these skills that you claim to have learned. And my mind was blown, right? Because I went to a business school in the United States in Boston, and we would have every month some sort of financial services institution come in through the doors, whether it's a bank, whether it's a securities, a brokerage house, to try and onboard us and say, you know what, we're offering these two things to students, and we would love for you to onboard not only just as a customer, but sometimes to test out new products, right? To make sure that they kept up to pace with younger people and their needs and how they engaged and interacted with technology. And somehow you're right, that mindset shift has not happened in a country like Pakistan at this point in time.
Yeah, and I would add to experiences like my experience as a student. When I went at 18, I was the first in, because in Pakistan, when I was here, you did not think about opening a bank account at 17 or 18, right? And then you go to university, the first thing that you land into a country and it is to open up a bank account. And the ability to get access to credit cards, it was seamless. Like there was not, there was no hindrance. I've been here 2.5 years now. I still don't have a credit card. Every time I apply for it, it gets rejected that I don't need a credit card and I should be a supplementary to one of my male counterparts in the family. And it's just really odd. I still use my Canadian credit card in Pakistan because the financial institutions refuse to give me one. And that's the reality.
Yeah, and I remember getting a Bank of America debit card within the first week of landing in Boston. A week or two after, when I got the full debit card in the mail, went back to the bank and they opened up a credit card for me for a $500 deposit that was payable back in 6 months if I maintained a good credit history. And that was it. In total, from door to door, from my place to the bank and back home, took an hour. And I was a credit card customer, right? And that just is how the financial system should operate. It should be inclusive. It should be geared towards onboarding as many people as you'd like. And I think that's, from a policy perspective, is also good, because then you digitize transactions, you formalize them. People can't evade taxes. There's more data flows about commercial activity. There's just so much more that can happen once you shift from a cash-based economy to one that is based on digital payments and cards. So I hope that things change in Pakistan. I want to switch gears a bit towards sort of your own personal journey. You talked about bank accounts and the issues that you faced when you moved from North America to Pakistan, but you are also a female founder in a male-dominated society and an even more male-dominated industry. What's that been like for you in terms of navigating these hallways that are dominated by men and being a founder and entrepreneur? And I just asked this because we had the co-founder of Sehat Kahani on board, and she had a fantastic story about how someone she was recruiting and interviewing came in and basically asked her कि कोई और senior है जिससे मैं बात कर सकता हूँ. He didn't believe that she was the owner of that institution, right? And so just was curious from a personal level how that's been like on your end.
So I've always been in a slightly male, predominantly male industries. Always been in the banking space, even in the culinary side of the world that I was in. It was again very, very male dominated. But I think the kind of experience that I've had, it taught me to be resilient, and it taught me to raise my hand, to ask for help when I need it. And I think as an entrepreneur, whether it is male or female, those two things have been really, really helpful, especially when I moved back. When I first moved back, I didn't necessarily have a network, but being able to build that network on my own onus and on my own credibility was tough. But there were as you start navigating your path, because the ecosystem is still very, very nascent, there are some incredible people out there willing to join hands with you in this journey that you take on, whether it's as advisors, coaches, mentors, and just that willingness as an entrepreneur as well, and putting yourself in those platforms and saying that building a company, it takes a village, right? And as an entrepreneur, it's a very, very lonely journey. And realizing that early on, it's also my second, I'm a second time founder. So I had some learnings from my first experience. And I was able to raise my hand and ask for help and build a network from a support system, which really plays that cushion when things get tough, which is pretty much every day. So it's hard. It's a very hard space to be, and there is a lot of glory and there's a lot of glamour around being a startup founder, but nobody knows what happens in the work that goes in, right? It takes a lot of failures. It takes a lot of resilience and persistence to be able to say that this is the vision that I want to be able to build for. And I will be able to do it, believing, having that faith in yourself and in the team that you build. But I have had multiple experiences, like Sarah would have mentioned, where men coming out and saying, hey, let me help you with your project. The choice of words there, and not making it's not a project, right? Like them just outright assuming that it's something I'm working as a passion project and it's not a real company. And then they want to be able to help me get my project moving forward at prices that are exuberant. A male talent or resource would suggest a price that would just be like, no, that doesn't make sense at all. If you go and quote that to a male founder or a male entrepreneur, they're like, that doesn't fly.
And he'll probably kick you out of the room.
Yeah, and these kinds of things we see quite often. At least in the first year, we saw that quite a bit. Now I think we've also figured out how that mindset works, and have some kind of, we're able to navigate in the ecosystem. So if it's not necessarily hiring from Pakistan, then we'll find resource elsewhere. And with COVID, that has also helped the remote working arrangement. So, but yeah, I think it's tough whether you're a man or a female. I think it is, being an entrepreneur is tough. It's just harder in Pakistan as a woman.
And so from that point of view, you said that people look at starting companies or being an entrepreneur as something glamorous. I personally think in a country like Pakistan, that's great, right? Because the new generation, rather than going into working at a bank, a B bank, let's say, or working at a Unilever or an Engro, increasingly they're looking towards entrepreneurship and innovation and trying to disrupt the market. And Pakistan's economy needs disruption. It needs people to have a fresh approach, a younger generation to change things up and help the country innovate. But with that, then also comes this sense of it's maybe not entitlement, but this perspective that is flawed in terms of what it takes to succeed as an entrepreneur. So from your experience, you're a second-time founder, what are some things that you would sort of, maybe advise to yourself 10 years ago as you were beginning and thinking about starting a startup, or some 18, 20-year-old coming out of a university who has ideas, who wants to either work at a startup or start their own business? Like, what are things that you would say are keys to success, or things that they should, learn from your own experience to succeed and excel?
I think success is different for everybody. And I think as somebody who wants to start, or if I were to start, like at least my first company, um, I would spend more time understanding the problem. I think where we fail, I mean, the startups that fail very early on is they get fixated to the problem that they to the solution that they've come up with, or the idea that they've had, right? And it's important, while it's great to have ideas, I think understanding where that's stemming from and getting fixated to the problem is extremely critical. Because if you are fixated to the problem, and that's the problem you want to be able to solve for, um, things will come, solutions will come. You will be more willing to listen to the customer and working with them rather than pushing out your own idea and your own solution. So I think that is really, really important. And I think the second thing is not chasing money and building a scalable, sustainable business. Money will come. But if you are able to understand deeply the problem that you want to solve for and how the customer wants you to solve that problem for them, I think it just makes it slightly easy and more fulfilling, because it is a frustrating journey, right? Like, there's 100 things will fail on a daily basis, and you will have to get up and run the company and face the team and face your board and go fundraise as well. So all of those things will continue happening, but having that conviction in yourself and that deep understanding, and letting go of a lot of egos. There's no room for ego when it comes to building companies. I think that would be something that I would give myself advice for, at least the first startup that I was starting out. And I think I learned a lot through that process and applied it here. And I took my time understanding the customer and the problem that I want to solve for, rather than just jumping into something.
Yeah, I think the first piece of your advice is so, so important, right? As you were explaining, like not being wedded to your own solution and looking at the problem holistically. Like, I was thinking about my own experience over the last 3 months. We've been trying to write an investment memo for a client with an operational model that we had initially talked about 4 months ago, and built the investment memo around it. How do you make it work? But it just wouldn't work, right? The risks weren't going away. The financial model would not work. The numbers were all over the place. And this week we were having a conversation. We were like, wait a minute, like, why are we continuing to make an operational model work when it's not even solving the basic problem that we're trying to solve for? So go back to the drawing board and make something simpler. And all of a sudden, everything starts working. It's simpler. There's less risk involved, but you sometimes get blinded by the solution you first came up with, and it's hard to let go of that, because the more you work on it, the more invested you are, and the less likely you become of, like, you don't want to look at other alternatives in that sense. So I think that's really, really good advice, and I think a lot of people get wedded to their solutions very early on in the process, and that's not great. In the last few months, we've seen, particularly in the pandemic, Pakistan's startup ecosystem thrive. Money has flowed in. Startups and founders are raising money. SECP, State Bank, has played a facilitative role to energize the sector even more. The ecosystem itself is a great sort of close-knit community, and there's a lot of camaraderie there, which is great to see. Where do you see the overall ecosystem going in the next year or two, in terms of outlook, in terms of your own journey, and where do you see potential in terms of Pakistan, which was not on the startup ecosystem map of the world for a number of years? All of a sudden, it's got the attention that it deserves.
Yeah, I think it's long time coming, right? There's a lot of work that was put in by people like Kulsum, Jihan, Misbah, and all of these people really worked hard to create that path for us to be here and get the the world excited about the opportunity that lies in Pakistan. So definitely very exciting times. I think in the next few years, we will see some really, really great companies come out. We've already seen likes of IKEA and then Tajer yesterday, the news that came out. So it's a very exciting space. I think more money will flow in, and more opportunities for people who are looking to start their own companies and have identified a problem that they want to solve for. It also gives them that slight cushion that I should be able to take that plunge now, right? Because it is in a very exciting time. So I think we'll see some really great ideas. We'll see a lot more money coming in. We'll also see we're the last exciting emerging market left to be untapped. And I think there's so much work that needs to happen, and there's so much opportunity. While there is opportunity, I think along with building for Pakistan, we also need to start building and honing the talent or resources that exist to be able to match the kind of money that is flowing in, and the kind of companies that we want to be able to build. So I think it has to be looked at holistically, and we need to identify where the gaps are and really solve for them really, really fast. And I think resourcing and talent is one of the bigger gaps that I see in the space at this point.
Do you think on that, do you see that more of a supply side issue in terms of the skills imparted to talent coming out of universities and colleges in Pakistan, or is it a bit of both where the supply is limited of top talent and then also the top talent either there's brain drain, they go abroad, or they're recruited by larger companies and there just isn't enough of that, supply coming in of top talent? How do you see the gap? Like, what's the reason for this gap?
I think it's both, right? I think we need to be able to teach the right kind of skills very early on, and critical thinking is one of them. Being able to analyze the situation, being able to solve for problems, just critically thinking is something that is lacking in the overall space. So I think that needs to be solved for, and that happens more on the academic side, and then even the jobs that they take on in terms of either going for MNCs or going abroad for better positions, that we'll be able to solve for because of the money that's coming in and the kind of compensation the companies will be able to provide. I think that compensation piece is solved for, but you can't solve for the American dream or the Canadian dream or the UK dream, right? That is a bit of a mindset shift that needs to happen. But I feel that can also be trained in universities and schools very early on, that you don't always have to work for bigger brands at this point. There is enough opportunity. I think also, I don't know if it's a generation thing or what, but that sense of entitlement that you talked about earlier as well, that exists, it's real. And that, I think that comes from just how the ecosystem has operated for so long. And if we're able to do that paradigm shift from the early onset in academics, we will be able to solve for it. But it has to match the pace at which things are moving, and people should be able to adapt.
Yeah, I think critical thinking is such a big gap, right? I mean, not to dive into politics or cultural war issues, but I don't know if you saw Malala's interview in Vogue, and she's getting a lot of hate on social media about questioning whether marriage is, why do people have to sign a contract to be married? Why can't it be a partnership? One, taken fully out of context, but two, I read it and I was like, I read the whole 2 paragraphs where she talks about this, and I was like, this is exactly what you need a 20-something-year-old to question. If a 20-year-old is not questioning big issues about life, big cultural norms, legal norms, societal norms, they're not going to change the world. They're not going to be innovative founders. They're not going to thrive at startups. They're not going to disrupt the economy or the country in the way that it needs to. And that is essential, right? So it clearly shows she is at least a critical thinker. And I think we need to like culturally change that mindset in the country as well, where the typical Pakistani line that "Badon se sawal nahi puchte," it is so counterintuitive. It is so damaging to the prospects of a society when you just say, don't ask questions from your elders. And I think you're right, at a very early educational age, if you can teach kids to be critically aware, to question things, and then engage with them when they have questions and make valid points, I think that's the way you progress as a society.
I think the other thing that is important, teaching them the importance of failure and encouraging and normalizing failure, right? There's so much shame around it. And that could also be very, very damaging for the ecosystem. And if you're always going at a pace without any focus and just running and not getting anywhere, it can be very, very damaging for the ecosystem as well. So realizing when to stop, realizing and understanding that it's time is over, or we need to pivot, or we need to be able to look at it creatively or take a step back. That also doesn't exist in the mindset of the resources, the talent that exists in Pakistan. I think that's extremely important as well. Just the importance of failing and failing fast, and then going at it again.
Yeah, I think one thing that's going for the digitally native generation, right, is that there's the internet, there's YouTube, everything's available on their fingertips. So compared to past generations, they have access to a lot more information. So hopefully one would hope that they learn faster, better, fail faster, better, and then recover from that. So that's the hope. Before I let you go, this has been a fantastic conversation. I always ask my guests to recommend 2 or 3 books that have deeply influenced them. So would love your recommendations. It can be on any topic: business, literature, history, whatever comes to your mind.
There's this one book that I recently read. I think it's called The Ride of a Lifetime by Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney. And I think it's a business book. It's very well written, but it resonated with me, and it talks a lot about that ability to fail and think creatively and stand up again and go at it and win it. So I think that whole Bob Iger's journey of taking on Disney at such critical times and moving into whatever he was able to do,
and now challenging Netflix with Disney Plus and like upending the streaming wars.
And then there is I recently read this book called Greenlights by Matthew McConaughey. It's a memoir, but he talks about resilience, and he talks about how when he had set up his mind to shift characters from being this in most of the early movies that he was in, rom-coms, to doing something more structured and serious. And that shift that happened, and his journey to get to that, and then eventually doing, I think, the Buyers Club or the Buyers Club. I'm really bad with names.
Dallas Buyers Club, yeah.
Yes, Dallas Buyers Club. I think that journey and the ups and downs, but just the faith in himself and his vision of how he wants his career to pan out, and the resilience that it takes for really great, but not what he wants to do, opportunities that came his way, and saying no to them, resonated quite a bit in the last few months of our journey with Oran and as entrepreneurs as well, right? So I think these are the 2 books that I've recently read, and they've been quite impactful in how I've navigated my path.
Well, I'm going to add these books to my list, especially Matthew McConaughey's one, because
well written as well.
And I've always wondered. I've always wondered with his acting, like from Wedding Crashers to Dallas Buyers Club and True Detective, like how does he pull it off? And sometimes I wonder, like, is he mentally okay in his head as he plays these roles, right? Because you just, we've seen the example of like Heath Ledger, for example, right, playing the Joker and not ever being able to come out of that tragically. So I'm actually curious to read this book and learn from that fact that, how is someone so good at playing this diverse range of roles, especially the more serious, traumatic characters that he's played, which, emotionally appeal to a lot of people and, make people like emotionally aware of what's going on around them. But what is it like for an actor to play those roles? So thank you so much for those book recommendations, and thank you so much for taking out the time. This has been a fantastic conversation, and wish you and your team all the best. And hopefully, you get to be a disruptive women-led for-women bank in Pakistan, and fill out that gender gap in financial inclusion and transform the economy. So more power to you on that.
Thank you so much, Uzair, for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation with you.
Thank you. Khudafis.
Bye-bye.